in many ways, the beginning of the college basketball offseason has began the same way that the beginning of this college basketball season began, and that's with controversy. The FBI investigation into college basketball has continued to rear its ugly head. And today, Kevin and Brad will break that down real quick for us before we get into transfers. A little more fun note, talking about some player movements, some good players that will be changing hands this offseason. But Brad, today's news, we add two teams to the mix in terms of under investigation. We had Kansas and North Carolina State. The allegations include North Carolina State assistant coach funneling money through Adidas to Dennis Smith to stay committed when he was during his recruitment process. There's also allegations tied to Silvio D'Souza at Kansas, as well as Billy Preston. Brad, what are your kind of thoughts on these new allegations, and what do you kind of think is the end game here?
So when I first saw the tweets, I didn't even realize that this was new allegations. I mean, I had totally forgotten that Kansas and NC State weren't already indicted or like in the middle of this thing. I know we got I think it was in February where Dennis Smith supposedly was on the ledger for taking tens of thousands of dollars. I don't remember what the exact sum was to go to NC State. So this really is no surprise on the NC State end. It is kind of surprising on the Kansas end, where it seems like this is not about Josh Jackson. I guess the timelines are not matching up. It seems, as you point out, it could be Silvio D'Souza or Billy Preston. And talk about getting nothing back on your investment there. I mean, D'Souza struggled until like the Big 12 tournament. The thing with Preston is, people were kind of angry at Kansas for keeping him out after that single car curb swiping with the fancy car. Like we never got to find out what exactly that car was. People were like, "Oh, Kansas did Billy Preston dirty," but if they kept him out for the whole season, they knew that this was coming. They knew that something was askew there with his financial situation and in that car he was driving.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting point here to kind of come to a T between Billy Preston and Silvio D'Souza, because if you look, D'Souza, there's specific mention of a second player committing on August 30th, 2017, and that's Silvio D'Souza's commitment. And so the idea that Bill Self rushed Silvio D'Souza to Kansas to get him into the fold immediately, when you also have this Billy Preston potential situation of being kind of forced out because we're looking at his potential involvement in this. How do we compare that? And I think it once again just shows, at least to me, that winning games is above all the most important. Obviously, Bill Self may not have had knowledge of a potential payment between Silvio D'Souza, his high school coaches, Adidas, excuse me. Obviously, we don't know the extent of which it's involved. I think most betting men, at least I've been throughout this process, assumed that these people have had knowledge of it just based on my familiarity with the college basketball landscape. But I think it's just a really interesting kind of intersection there between D'Souza and Preston, those two very similar but very different cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also kind of similar to a USC where they held out DeAnthony Melton. And then we find out on the ledger that supposedly Chimezie Metu and I think Benny Boatwright too had supposedly received money. I know Boatwright we could touch on in a little bit. Very shocking decision to return to USC. But the fact that they kept DeAnthony Melton out the whole season and didn't have Metu miss any games, despite there being more evidence, at least publicly, that Metu was bought, kind of suggests that they knew something that they weren't letting on. They didn't feel like they had the plausible deniability that would allow them to play Melton. And I know that they didn't make the NCAA tournament. A lot of people kind of said it was because that they didn't have Melton, but I mean there were so much more problems going on there than just missing their third or fourth best player.
Yeah, I think you make a great point on the plausible deniability, point of view in terms of, I think it once again goes back to, I don't think these athletic departments actually care about being compliant as much as they may say so. I think it's more just a situation of, what are we going to get caught in? And if they don't believe they're going to get caught in a position where they're appearing to have a lack of institutional control, I know those are the big words around this time whenever there's an investigation. I think that's where it kind of stops. I think the other side of this, we mentioned Kansas is NC State with Dennis Smith, and then obviously Cal State Northridge now having hired Mark Gottfried when it was kind of known his connection to this. What do you make of Cal State Northridge's decision there? And do you think, personally, I don't care. You're a small mid-major program that had no success. If you want to hire Rick Pitino or Mark Gottfried or whoever may have you, that's going to be a better coach than you're going to pull anyway. I don't have a problem with it. And I also can't see Adidas coordinating to give the bag to a player to go to Cal State Northridge.
Yeah, that was a weird situation because that in my eyes that's a great hire for Cal State Northridge. Like they got this big brand name, and I think a lot of the negativity surrounding the hire was based on people like these as Tony Patel calls them, the blue check mafia. They kind of knew something that they weren't letting on as to his place in the scandal, and rumors over the years about him being kind of a dirty coach. I know I don't have many sources, Kevin, at all, but I heard a few years ago about certain players at NC State getting paid. So it just comes with the territory. Guys like to defend certain coaches that they have a relationship with. We saw it last weekend with John Rothstein taking a lot of heat in the effort of saving sources. And so I think some schools some media members like to have a certain opinion in order to keep getting their sources and stuff.
Yeah, I think I could kind of go on all day with what you're saying. John Rothstein, in my opinion, has no opinion. His opinion is the opinion of the people who talk to him, and those are college basketball coaches. And I respect that he's able to get as many scoops as he does, but I barely even I don't have any respect for him as a journalist because of his inability to separate that. And it's obviously a line that every journalist learns to bridge, and I just don't know that he's necessarily done a good job with that. But I think we could kind of go on all day about this FBI stuff. It's a mess, and there's certainly more to come. Every time we hear a little leak, there's always more to come. So let's kind of wait on that and get into kind of the bigger main theme of this show today, and that's transfers, NBA draft, recruiting, just kind of whip around through the college basketball landscape because there's been a lot of movement over the last couple of days. I know Monday was a big day, kind of the headliner, a few headliners. We had Ryan Taylor commit to Northwestern, the Evansville transfer. We had Tariq Owens transfer from St. John's to Texas Tech. Sasha Kalia-Jones transferring from Kentucky, kind of being replaced by E.J. Montgomery, a top 2018 prospect. Ashton Hagen's committed this morning to Kentucky. He's a blue chip 2019 prospect who could reclassify. Those are just a couple of kind of the bigger stories we've seen over the last couple of days in the recruiting player movement perspective, although I'm sure there's more. Brad, where do you kind of want to get started here? I was thinking we could start close to home for me with the Northwestern Wildcats and picking up Ryan Taylor.
Yeah, so I can throw it to you to start about Ryan Taylor. I know he's a 20-point per game guy. He's got great size for the wing, but how else is he going to fit into this Northwestern team, and where does this elevate Northwestern in terms of tournament status?
So I'm pretty high just in general on this roster makeup at this point for Northwestern. I know they're still working on Matt Mooney, which would be kind of the cherry on top for this club, because I just kind of think they're building towards that positionless pace and space look. you look up and down the roster next year, it's full of 6'6" guys who can defend and shoot it. Ryan Taylor, not necessarily known as a great defender, but I think part of that was, you're doing so much in the offensive end at Evansville. Maybe his defense can improve at Northwestern. I kind of see him stepping into a similar role that Scotty Lindsey did. Certainly a volume scorer, but a guy who's an elite shooter, much better than Lindsey. But yeah, as I was mentioning with the length, looking up and down this team, AJ Turner coming in from Boston College is 6'6". Ryan Taylor 6'6". Vic Law 6'7". Pete Nance is 6'8", maybe as big as 6'10", very skinny freshman who's very a hyped recruit for Northwestern. Pete Nance is 6'7", a top 100 player from Texas coming in. Jordan Lathan is from Grandview, Missouri. He's likely to get the range as the starting point guard next season. He's 6'4", 6'5" with a game-ready body. So you're just looking up and down the rotation for next season, and you're seeing a lot of athletes. That's not even to mention Anthony Gaines, who's 6'4", had an excellent freshman season for the Wildcats. So you look up and down this roster, you see a lot of physicality. It's probably the most athletic roster Northwestern basketball's ever had. Looking back at the Carmody era and maybe non-athletic teams more, embracing the Princeton-style offense, things of that nature. This is going to be an extremely athletic team. Derek Parton's back in the post. I think there's some pretty high upside there. I would say the one thing that I'm kind of hesitant on is just how does their offense look? Jordan Lathan as a freshman will be given a lot of pressure as a point guard if Northwestern's going to run a similar offense to what they did this year, which was a lot of pick and rolls, a lot of isolation, keeping the ball in the point guard's hands. I'd like to see more of a spread pick and roll system where they can attack gaps and things of that nature, take a little pressure off of Lathan and put and allow those wings and who are so talented up and down this roster to make plays.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Northwestern is still going after Matt Mooney, and it seems, based on the current roster structure, that they have one spot left. So would that mean that they would go Mooney over trying to get a point guard?
I think that's the question. I don't think Mooney really – they don't need another two. So I think what they'd wind up doing is letting Mooney play as a lead guard. I mean, Bryant McIntosh was a score-first player when he came in from high school. I think Chris Collins would see him in a similar role, having the ball in his hands a lot and creating. I mean, he had 3 assists a game this past season, so he's kind of a combo guard. He's a guy who can play a little bit of point. I think if they brought in Mooney, it would be in more of a lead guard type of position, not playing off the ball, just because the depth at point guard is not very strong. It's Lathan, as I mentioned, then Jordan Ash, who's a very solid player, like a nice 10-minute a game backup point guard, but he doesn't really do much on the floor. I think Northwestern could use that depth at the point guard spot. So I think they'd be looking for Mooney to at least handle the ball part of the time.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I've been trying to track these transfers. I separated them between the sit outs and the grad transfers. So the grad transfers are much more valuable because you get them right away, and you can kind of take more of a risk because you're not tying in a large investment into them. It's just 1 year and done. And so I think from what I found, about half of the who I think are potential high major or A10 AAC grad transfers, like those are the leagues where they could transfer up to. About half of them are point guards. So there are plenty of options out there from guys like a Larry Austin or a Trey Campbell who played at Vanderbilt and Georgetown respectively, who are probably more of backup point guards at the high major level. Same like a Nick Norton from UAB. You could bring them in to be your backup point guard, or in Northwestern's case, they see Jordan Lathan maybe as this guy of the future. You can grab one of them to kind of supplement and be a steady presence. And then there are other guys who are out here who I think are real difference makers. For tournament teams. I know I saw the other day that Justin Coleman, former top 100 recruit, played at Alabama. Last year was at Samford. I saw that he's taking a visit to St. Louis, which would be an amazing fit for Coleman. And then there are some other guys that should be on Northwestern's radar if they miss on Matt Mooney. A guy like Joe Chartouni from Fordham, or Christian Cunningham from Samford. Zach Johnson from Florida Gulf Coast is another very, very highly regarded point guard from the mid and low major level. Jalen Patterson from LSU is kind of a forgotten guy. Got recruited over by Tremont Waters and opted to redshirt last year, even though he was healthy. He was a solid player for LSU in previous seasons. And then a couple of recent adds to the grad transfer market: Terrence Smith from Duquesne and Quan Four from Richmond. Both guys average double figures in the A10 and should rental.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different, potential options for Northwestern if they do swing and miss on Matt Mooney. I know he's kind of priority number one. It will be interesting to see, how much trust that Chris Collins has in Jordan Lathan. He was obviously recruited to be the point guard of the future, and with Bryant McIntosh, that was, coming from day one on the start. And will that be the same case for Lathan? I don't know. I think the talent around this team at this point implies to me it's almost necessary to go get one more piece just in case Lathan's ready. You can't have a wasted season with the amount of talent that Northwestern, potentially could have next season by not having that depth at point guard, at least a steady hand like a Larry Austin, like you mentioned, that would at least be able to come in for 15 minutes and put out some fires. But I just think, getting Ryan Taylor, certainly a talented player, 42% from three, 21 points a game at Evansville, speaks volumes about Northwestern, what Chris Collins has done there. But also, who is recruiting Ryan Taylor? I mean, UCLA recruited Ryan Taylor, Arizona recruited Ryan Taylor. Pretty much every single, big program in college basketball recruited Ryan Taylor. I have the list here in front of me that I put on my article that I put up on a Northwestern publication. Butler, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Illinois, Georgetown, Indiana, UCLA, Arizona, Miami, Purdue, Maryland, and Missouri, among those who expressed interest. And so you combine him with a top 25 class in college in the class rankings from 24/7 with two top 100 players. Depending on where you look for Miller Kopp, if he's a top 100 kid, I think he is from most of the rankings I've seen. Looking here right now at 24/7, they have him at 108. But regardless, it's just an extremely loaded class, and it speaks to everything that Chris Collins has done. It speaks to everything that Northwestern has done with their facilities, building the new Welsh Ryan Arena. That will be fabulous next season. And certainly whether they can make the tournament again next season or not with a young team, I think the future is pretty bright in Evanston.
Yeah, definitely. I think even if they were to miss on their top point guard targets, I still think that they're a pretty realistic pick for the NCAA tournament. From what I've seen from Jordan Lathan, I really like his game. I think transitioning to another team that my boss at Busted Brackets, Lucas Harkins, wants us to touch on his own Butler Bulldogs, and specifically Jordan Tucker. Jordan Tucker was a Duke freshman. He was top 75, had a few opportunities to play at a primetime school like Syracuse with more playing time. He chose to kind of battle it out at Duke and then ended up leaving after half of the season. He will be eligible at the semester mark for Butler, which is never a promising thing. I don't have a lot of empirical data to back this up, but it seems like anyone who is a mid-semester signee usually does not make too much of an impact, and then it's the year after where they make the impact. So, Kevin, what do you think about Jordan Tucker and his place on the Butler Bulldogs?
It's going to be really interesting to watch Jordan Tucker because obviously he's a big-time talent and a bigger talent than Butler's typically going to be able to recruit. And I think we're seeing Laval Jordan do that, whether it's with Jordan Tucker, whether it's trying to get involved with Mark Smith from Illinois. I know there was at least some mention that they were interested there. I think there's other guys that they've inquired on. They have two more spots to fill this year that I expect them to look aggressively at the transfer market to do so. But I think it'll be interesting to kind of watch this balance between Tucker and Kamar Baldwin in kind of a wings situation. Baldwin, certainly a talented kid. I think he's going to be expected to be the number one option offensively. But certainly Tucker will have every opportunity to make an impact right away. in that kind of combo 3-4 role that they've used Keelan Martin in. I think like in terms of a fit for roster makeup, it's about as perfect as it comes to swap Jordan Tucker for Keelan Martin. I think they're pretty similar players.
Yeah, I do agree that he's a pretty good fit. My one thing, like from an overall perspective from Butler, I do think that they need to go out and get a grad transfer power forward. That's the spot where Martin played most of his minutes, and with Tucker having to miss the first part of the year, it's always tough transitioning back into that. But in terms of Butler as a whole, I was pretty down on them coming into last year. I thought that they would be like right on the bubble and potentially miss the NCAA tournament. They ended up getting a 9 seed, which is I think a little lower than most people projected. But they was so reliant on Baldwin and Martin, and now with Martin gone, I think that they may take another step back this year, and I think I might put them back where I had them previously. Right on that bubble. Just this team looks so reliant on Baldwin as a scorer. Hopefully Tucker can step in, but he's played little to none in his college career. I really like Henry Badley and Sean McDermott as players, but they don't really create too much offense. Jorgensen's like a nice sixth man kind of offensive spark plug, but he's more of a shooter still. And then Aaron Thompson is not an offensive player at all. He's a starting point guard. He's very good, kind of like prober, he kind of drives and makes decisions, and he's an excellent defender. But overall, I think that offense could really be Butler's Achilles heel next year.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Just one quick note on Butler. They are in the top 6 for Bryce Golden, a Maryland product who is one of the better 2018 players still available. He's considering Connecticut, Georgetown, Illinois, Syracuse, Wichita State, and Butler, decommit from Pitt. So that's another guy who could help in that power forward spot, kind of a stretch 4. So that's one potential piece that they could add to the mix. As far as another team that I think we wanted to touch on was Kentucky. And Sasha Kalia-Jones in particular. I saw Sam Vecini from The Athletic, who I really respect his work, say that he thought Kalia-Jones was now the best transfer on the market. And that was with, Joe Cremo still out there with, I think Ryan Taylor hadn't quite committed yet, but if he had, it was just recent. I thought it was a little blasphemous to suggest that Sasha Kalia-Jones was that good. I mean, certainly has talent. Certainly a player who, with the right coaching and during his sit-out year, could be a good starter for a Power 5 team. But what's your kind of stock in Sasha Kalia-Jones at this point, Brad?
Yeah, so I totally agree that he's definitely not the best transfer out there. If you weight grad transfers more heavily because they can play right away, I think you have to give guys like Mooney and Cremo. Even in terms of sit-out transfers, I think the biggest name is Malachi Flynn, whose recruitment has been awfully quiet since the Washington State fan page wrote that scathing article about him. And then Kobe McEwen from Utah State is another guy who I think is a better player, or at least potential prospect, than Sasha Kalia-Jones. I think he'll be Creighton bound, Kobe McEwen. But in terms of Sasha, I know that Virginia is the obvious fit because he was a former commit there. I would be weary going to Virginia though, because I watched a b-ball breakdown video on them after they lost to UMBC, and Coach Nick was pointing out that their bigs have to screen so much in the offense that a guy like Kalia-Jones, who's coming from a spot where he didn't play a prominent offensive role, maybe he doesn't want to be a screener so often. He wants some more touches. Maybe he wants to play and pick and pop a little bit. So that's worth noting. And then the Ashton Hagans, and even bringing back Nick Richards, which was totally unexpected. And EJ Montgomery. Those 3 additions are going to be huge. Kentucky probably has the deepest team right now in the country. Still don't think that they're the best. I think that they're probably top 4, top 5 team right now. They have some amazing point guard depth. Where do you think that these additions have Kentucky?
Yeah, they're a really interesting team to peg right now. I'm gonna be honest, I'm super down on Nick Richards. He's very old for a freshman, so I don't quite give a pass as terms of reading some NBA draft people who use the age thing is very important. I've been trying to embrace it a little bit more, and I don't necessarily give him quite as much of a pass as a freshman, although I know he is kind of learning the game. I kind of see Nick Richards doing a Marcus Lee, staying one more year, not really getting the time, and then transferring out. I think Quade Green's in a really interesting spot. Should Ashton Hagans requalify, which my gut says he will, where does Quade Green fit into the mix? / does Quade Green transfer with Emmanuel Quickly and Ashton Hagans already in the mix? You're still going to have Keldon Johnson, Tyler Hero, and Jamari Baker as potential guys who can play on the wing. And then up front, they're going to be really deep. Nick Richards, as we mentioned, Montgomery, Wenyen Gabriel should be back, although it's possible he does go pro. Jared Vanderbilt and PJ Washington as well, high-level pieces. So they're in a pretty good spot right now, Kentucky. I know Jeff Goodman's been getting a lot of heat because he wrote the article that Coach K had destroyed Cal on the recruiting trail and it was over. I still kind of agree because Ashton Hagans and EJ Montgomery weren't like Duke's number one guy. Like Duke got 1, 2, and 3 in this class, but I did still find it funny right after that story for those two commits to come down.
Yeah, it's very hard for Kentucky and Kentucky fans to complain about recruiting when, like, looking at this roster, all 11 guys were in the top 100. Baker was the lowest ranked. He was in the 60s. The second lowest ranked, I think, was Tyler Herro, who was in like the 20s. And then, Quade Green was in the 20s. Montgomery was a top 10. Gabriel was on the cusp of top 10. Richards and Vanderbilt were in that range too. So, they don't have any like surefire like top 5 one and dones like Duke has, but they have guys who, maybe they'll stay for year 2, maybe they'll stay for year 3. And that's when you truly see that huge impact and that huge jump. Yeah,
wouldn't it be funny if Kentucky started getting guys to stay for 2 years and Duke kept losing one and done, so then Kentucky won a national title or two, and then we question if the one and done could ever work for Coach K? That would be a fun, fantastic storyline that I would look forward to. Let's flip to a team we already touched on in the beginning of this podcast because of their dealings off the court in Kansas. I just think we should touch on them real quick just because of all the roster turnover they're going to have now, losing LeGerald Vick as well as Malik Newman. Looks like Udoka Azubuike will stay. Looks like the recruiting class will remain intact. I know they're still heavily involved with Romeo Langford. I've seen kind of differing opinions of whether he's, a realistic chance to go to Kansas, but certainly the best player available on most people's boards. So certainly they'll go all in, but they're going to lose a lot of talent. I still have them number 1, I think, preseason, although I'm kind of subject to change on that because I love the transfers they're bringing in, but it's going to be pretty much a clean sweep with the exception of Azubuike.
Yeah, so I have Kansas still at number 3. I haven't moved them down since the Newman and Vick departures. I think, Azubuike, I don't know if he's explicitly said that he's coming back, but with now Silvio De Souza kind of up in the air at this point, it is crucial that Azubuike comes back for Kansas. They also have Dedrick Lawson, who I think is probably their best player and best. I won't say their best pro prospect because that's probably Quentin Grimes, their freshman 2 guard. But Lawson will probably be their best player. He can, average like 18 and 8 for them, perhaps. And then they have 2 great options at point guard with Charlie Moore, who had a very strong freshman year at Cal, and then Devin Dotson, who's a top 20 player in the country. So they're loaded at every position, especially if they get Romeo Langford. They'll be like legitimately, 8 or 9, like super deep. And then Marcus Garrett is one of my favorite glue guys. I watched a ton of Kansas towards the end of the season, and Garrett's ability to handle the ball and play multiple positions was really appealing. And I think he's a jump shot away from being NBA prospect himself.
Yeah, I think you hit Kansas pretty well. I'll add one more thing. I'm a huge Devon Dotson fan, and that is from watching like 2 highlight tapes and the entire game when him and Zion Williamson played LaMelo Ball in that wild game last summer in Vegas. Um, I'm just really high on him. I thought he was the best player on the floor in that game I watched. I've watched several, highlight sets that make me think he's kind of that perfect pass first point guard, that perfect piece going forward for Kansas. That they love to have a good point guard out there. Obviously, everyone does, but Kansas has been especially successful with point guards, and I think Devon Dotson's going to be an excellent player there. Let's move across the Big 12, Brad, real quick to Texas Tech, just to touch on Tariq Owens heading out there and kind of their roster at this point for next season. They're doing kind of everything that you expected this team to do in terms of embrace these long athletes. If they can bring Zaire Smith back, my gut says he does stay. It would be crushing if they can't keep him. But Zaire Smith, Jarrett Culver, you're going to bring in Kevon Moore, who's kind of this long athletic wing as a freshman. Tariq Owens will play the 4 and the 5 for them, super athletic and long block shots. Kind of the only question you're going to still have is the point guard spot. I know they have C.J. Roberts coming in from a Missouri transfer, and then as well as Davide Moretti. I still think one more point guard would be beneficial to this kind of rotation. But I'm a big fan of this Texas Tech team. I have them top 25.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, especially with the point guard situation. Roberts is a guy who has to sit the first semester because he was redshirting at Missouri, but he left just in time to be eligible for the second semester this year. But as we mentioned with Jordan Tucker, that's a tough transition. And then Moretti, and then they have a senior Josh Webster who hardly played last year. But I think a grad transfer point guard is a borderline necessity at this point. Moretti's a solid player. He's a good shooter. He was a rotation player for Texas Tech last year, but they really need like a more dynamic creator to replace Keenan Evans, who is responsible for creating so much offense. Zaire Smith, if he stays, Texas Tech will stay in my top 25. If he leaves, I think I have to bump him out. I really like Kevon Moore, though. He was a former top 10 player in the class, but he's a very inconsistent player, which bumped him down to around like the 40s and 50s. He can handle the ball. He has some point forward skills. And then they have Deshaun Corprew, who is a very highly regarded junior college player coming in. And then, a lot of people have been making, I think, a bigger deal of this Tariq Owens commitment than is reasonable or they should. I know when he was still considering VCU, I saw a bunch of VCU fans talking about he'll come to VCU and they'll let him shoot threes and they'll let him have all this offensive freedom. Like, you don't know what kind of player that Tariq Owens is. He's more of like an energy, like shot blocker, rim protector, more of a dump off guy. He can shoot threes, but that's not his game at all. You don't want him shooting a lot of threes. I know Texas Tech fans had Tommy Hamilton last year, who I really liked, dating back to his time at DePaul. But Hamilton's a much better offensive player than Owens. Owens is more in there for his energy and his shot blocking, and anything he provides you offensively is more of a bonus.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think the reason why people have talked about, him shooting threes, things like that, is he mentioned that he wanted to be able to play the 4 more at his new destination. Didn't really like that he was going to be stuck at the 5 at St. John's for a senior year. Look at the numbers. I thought his numbers are just a bit inflated just because I don't think he's a 30-minute-a-game player. At a team that had more depth, St. John's was basically like 6 deep this season by the end of the year, so he had to play as much as they basically could. But he averaged 8.5 points, 6 rebounds, almost 3 blocks, shot 50% from the field, and made about a half a 3 a game at 32% clip. So the shot's there. It's that I would agree. It's not something I want to like play through, but he is a capable player. I think, as you said, he just brings that energy, that athleticism. And with Texas Tech, when they're going to run and press, and he's going to be back there anchoring the defense, but also, able to switch and play in man-to-man. It's going to be a dangerous, setup for them. I think they could be really good defensively. Fouls have been a concern throughout Tarek Owens' career. They'll have to keep that in check. But overall, I would say a pretty darn good pickup for Chris Beard, going to a crowd. I know Maryland wanted him. I know that Texas Tech obviously wanted him. Western Kentucky was involved late. They couldn't pull it off. Western Kentucky will be literally after every grad transfer from my conversations with people close to that program. So we'll look for the Hilltoppers at some other point later on this podcast. But for now, we have Tariq Owens headed to Texas Tech.
And so then we got a request today from Kim Jong Skills to talk about Femi. Does that seems like Ajul Olujobi, yes. From NCAA&T, averaged 16.3 and 7.7 rebounds for NCAA&T. I've heard nothing inside, but like on kind of Twitter and stuff, that he is visiting St. John's, and I would expect him to commit to St. John's. They really need another 5-man. They have Seti Kita, who's a South Carolina transfer, who he's much better than he showed at South Carolina. He will be a suitable starting center for St. John's, and maybe even an upgrade from Tarek Owens. But they really need another big man in there, especially an immediate eligible veteran like Femi. He should play 15 minutes a game and have a pretty nice impact as a third big.
Yeah, that's kind of my deal, is how do we value Femi Olajobi? I'm going to try to get that name down, but we're going to roll with that being the pronunciation on that. On one hand, his first 2 seasons, kind of background in him, because he's kind of like one of the forgotten men on the grad transfer market. Began his career at Oakland in the Horizon League. Maybe that's why Kim Jong Skills is wondering. I know he's the fan of Oakland through my interactions with him in the past. He averaged 9 minutes a game and 1.7 points, 1.6 rebounds. As a freshman, that dropped to 6 minutes a game as a sophomore for 1.1 points, 1.4 rebounds. Then he transfers to NCAA&T, which beat one D1 team all season in 2016-17, and he averages 16 points, 8 rebounds, shoots 30% from 3, 54% from the field overall. Turnovers were high, but that's kind of to go along with the usage. And that NCAA&T team, big rally to 20-15 on the season, 11-5 in MEAC play. So if you want to argue it, you could say that Femi Olajobi is the most important player in college basketball this past season. So personally, I am skeptical of the impact from some of these really low major kids who struggled at higher levels and then exploded at the A-East or the MEAC level. We saw that kind of with Wesley Myers this year at South Carolina, maybe not giving quite the same impact. But if you just have to be reasonable with your expectations, they can obviously be rotation players. I think Olajobi would be a nice rotation player for St. John's. They obviously need big man help. But if you come in expecting 10 points and 6 rebounds in 25 minutes a game, I think they'll be doomed from the start with Olajobi.
Yeah, and I think a side note, I think St. John's will actually be pretty good next year, barring injuries. And of course, if they get Femi in there, they have a very good starting 5 with Mikey Dixon taking over from Marcus Levette. In that kind of two scoring guard plus Justin Simon backcourt, I think is a real recipe for success. I think that St. John's could even move up to like 5th or 6th in the conference. Do you have similar opinions, or are you more realistic on St. John's?
I haven't dug, to be honest, too deep on them. I like Mikey Dixon a lot. I watched him play probably 5 or 6 times for significant stretches of game while he was at Quinnipiac. Probably a little more than that, actually, because I saw him at the MAC tournament. But he's an impressive kid. He can really score the basketball. I think he kind of brings in that Energizer Bunny 6-man type role who could give him maybe 10 points a game as this season. I wouldn't think that's out of the question. Still not going to be a deep roster. I think the roster is still going to be in flux. I know they're looking for 2 sit-out. I believe what I read was 2 sit-out guys and a one who can play right away. So that would fit in with Olajobi. I know they're involved with David Carraher, who's a former Butler commit who spent this season at Houston Baptist, had an excellent season there. So those are some of the guys to look at potentially at St. John's.
Yeah, and there's so many guys out there, presumably on the wing, for sit-out transfers. I know. I mean, just like going up and down the list, Eli Wright from Mississippi State could get a look. C.J. Jones from Arkansas, Caleb Ledoux and Rasheem Dunn from the mid-major ranks. I mean, I can go on and on. I mean, there are plenty of options out there. Any other teams that you would want to touch on?
I think we're good on the teams. I figured what we could do to kind of wrap up the show would be hit just a few players, who are going to change hands, especially in the grad transfer market potentially, and just cover those guys and where their recruitments lie at this point. I'll start it off with Joe Cremo, the Albany transfer. I've seen him play a ton over his collegiate career with my ties to the Albany area. He's an excellent player. I don't necessarily think that he's a superstar for a Power 5 team. I don't think if you come in expecting 15 a game, you're going to get it. But he's just the perfect glue piece because he doesn't have a big ego on the floor. He's a willing passer. He shot 46% from 3 last season, 18 points a game. He's just a tremendous player, and he's kind of the perfect glue piece for a lot of teams. I think it'll really depend on the landing spot to project numbers. I know he's visiting Creighton, I believe, this weekend. It's definitely coming up. That'd be a good fit, especially if they lose Kyrie Thomas, because you have the chance to come in and score a lot right away. If that's something he's looking to do at a high major level, try to bring a team to the NCAA tournament. If he's looking for that role player situation, there's a bunch of spots that he could land. I know Syracuse would be a role player spot, although I haven't really seen him connected there too much late. Duke even was connected to Joe Cremo, especially with Gary Trent leaving. He'd be kind of that perfect 2 guard for if they're going to play Trey Jones, and then the 3, 4, and 5 being RJ, Zion, and Cam Reddish. If they go small, which I hope they will, that would be a good option there. So Cremo's an interesting kid. He's gonna fit wherever he lands. I don't have any question that Joe Cremo will be a good grad transfer wherever he winds up.
Yeah, and Lucas Harkins wanted us to talk about Creighton too, and specifically Kyrie Thomas. But I think Thomas is gone, and I think Cremo would be an excellent choice to fill the void. I know if Tyus Battle leaves Syracuse, he would fit just as well with the orange. And then you broke down the Duke scenario, which I think should be pretty appealing to him. So those are the 3. I saw that Louisville and him kind of stopped talking. And then the Creighton situation is perfect because they lose Thomas and they lose Foster, and they desperately need scoring. I think that they could sneaky be a kind of a bad team next year because they relied so heavily on Foster and Thomas, and then Krompel's coming back from injury. Who knows how healthy he will be. So they really need someone. They could play him with Mitch Ballack and have just so much shooting on the floor for the Creighton Blue Jays.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm a little higher than you, I think, on Creighton, just because I generally trust Greg McDermott to kind of reload. I think Damian Jefferson's actually going to be pretty good there, the transfer from New Mexico. I like Tyshawn Alexander and Mitch Ballack, 2 guys you mentioned. They have Marcus Zagorowski signed. He's going to be a pretty good recruit for them. They have no spots open. That would change if Kyrie Thomas does depart. I think the dream scenario for them, and this would probably require 1 transfer, which they could probably do. They have 1 guy on the team, Jordan Scurry, who's a former walk-on, so perhaps he could go back off scholarship. Maybe just had an opening this year and they gave it to him. I don't know the background there, but I think the dream scenario would be Cremo for this year, and then Kobe McEwen, they're recruiting as well from Utah State, a sit-out transfer who's probably the most talented, just raw talent player available, other than maybe Kalia Jones that we mentioned earlier in the podcast. McEwen would be a great fit. Creighton made the Final Three there, so I think the dream scenario, as I said, would be get that immediate help and then get that long-term help.
You actually read my mind, because I was going to bring up that exact scenario, breaking down Kobe McEwen's Final Three, where Grand Canyon is a mid-major, and then Marquette has some pretty good guards already there, so it wouldn't be a guarantee that he would play this huge role. I really like Greg Elliott and Jamal Cain for them, and they have Brendan Bailey too, who's a former top 50 recruit who was on a Mormon mission. He's eligible this year, so he'd be a sophomore when Kobe McEwen is eligible. But Creighton would be the perfect fit, because they need Cremo scoring this year, and then when Cremo leaves, they can just fill his spot with Kobe McEwen. I also wanted to mention Jacob Epperson, who played really well after burning his red shirt kind of midway through the season. He's big. He can catch lobs out of the pick and roll, similar to Justin Patton. He's not quite the athlete that Patton is, but he can also shoot the ball. So he's a very, very intriguing long-term piece as well.
All right, good stuff there from Brad. A couple more transfers before we wrap things up, just because unless you don't have a Twitter account, I'm sure you're already sick of transfer talk, as it certainly rules my feed. One guy I wanted to mention real quick is a grad transfer, maybe not the biggest name, but a guy I think will make a big impact wherever he lands, just because he's kind of the perfect rotation player, is Michael Finke from Illinois originally. He's a guy that is considering, I have the list in front of me here, I'm getting it up. It's Stanford, Nevada, Grand Canyon, Penn State, and Vanderbilt. Grand Canyon, his brother Tim Finke is committed to play there next season in 2018, so that's kind of a natural fit, kind of the way Grand Canyon was able to grab Casey Benson a season ago with his brother being an assistant. I think he's just like a good fit for several teams. Nevada, he'd be kind of that floor spacing offensively, but strong enough defensively player to play the 5 for them. Stanford could obviously use help up front, especially if Reed Travis does grad transfer. I don't expect that, but at this point, anything's possible. Penn State could use that depth, and Vanderbilt, a veteran piece, would always be beneficial when you're bringing in such a highly touted freshman group like Darius Garland, potentially Romeo Langford, Simi Shitu.
Yeah, I don't really have a great feel for where he will go. I kind of feel like he might end up at Grand Canyon, although they do have two pretty good bigs. I know that we mentioned earlier. We mentioned on an earlier podcast, Alessandro Lever had a really promising freshman year, and then Robert Blumsbergs was a very, very highly recruited big man as well.
Yeah, I think fit-wise, I don't love the Grand Canyon fit, but like from a personal perspective, I know he's a pretty religious person as well. Michael Finke, from what I've read and seen, Kevin always goes as deep as he can on these grad transfers to find their expected destination. Grand Canyon, a religious school, maybe that comes into play. We'll see. Regardless, there's certainly a strong connection there for Grand Canyon, which explains their presence in the top 5. Brad, any transfers you wanted to touch on before we wrap up this wonderful show?
I think I'll just throw out that Xavier got 2 grad transfers to help them reload. They got Zach Hankins, who is the Division II Player of the Year. He's a center from Ferris State who will play major minutes for them up front, split time with Tyreek Jones. And they got Kyle Castlin from Columbia, who will play a lot on the wing. I think that Castlin will probably end up in the starting lineup as well. And then Albany transferred David Nichols to Florida State to replace C.J. Walker. That's a pretty big addition for them. Gives them even more perimeter firepower to go along with that 3-headed monster at center. I think Florida State should be back in the NCAA tournament and maybe even a top 25 team again next year.
Yeah, I think Xavier, looking at them, I think they could be a top 25 team. They haven't been a lot of people's top 25s early this season, in the preseason, I should say, but especially with these grad transfer traditions, I really like this team. I think Travis Steele will do a wonderful job. As for Florida State, David Nichols is honestly like the perfect replacement for CJ Walker, and that I don't want to say they're the same player, but they're like very similar. Like neither are like high assist guys, which is okay in that system. Nichols can score very, very well in isolation and pick and roll. They run a lot of pick and roll, a lot of isolation. Nichols is a smart kid who's graduating in 3 years with a 3.9 GPA. Florida State, a pretty good school. So just on all factors, a good fit for Nichols. I think a lot of people kind of assumed he would head closer to home in the Chicago area. I know Northwestern, obviously, we touched on needing a point guard. Loyola has been mentioned with several transfers. And then also I had seen a rumbling that maybe UAB would have interest. I know one of their assistants has a pretty strong Chicago connection, and they've got a couple of recruits coming in from that area. They need a point guard with McNorton leaving. So we will see but Nichols obviously lands at Florida State. We will have, several other transfers to touch on over the coming days, coming weeks. We'll try to not make the podcast all just be about transfers, because we could certainly try to mix it up a little bit week to week. But once again, guys, thanks for listening. Any more on the FBI investigation, we'll touch on that as it comes as well. Enjoy baseball season, guys. I'm a Red Sox fan. It's been pretty great to watch so far. They trounced the Yankees tonight. Brad, what's your baseball allegiance before we sign off?
So I used to be really into baseball until a few years ago when I just decided, no more baseball, no more football, just all basketball all the time.
Yeah, I've definitely, between following and running my site, and also just, being in college, it's just tougher to commit the time to a baseball game every night. When I'm home, I try to watch the games, especially because I'm just generally not as busy. But tonight I watched much of the Red Sox game while I was doing some reading. It was a great time. So I'll definitely be checking out more baseball, but don't worry, you've got me on Twitter at any moment. If you guys want to talk college basketball, I'm glad to do them. I'll probably do some Twitter Q&A over the next couple of weeks. That was something I did a lot last offseason. People loved it. So that will be back at some point. So stay out on the lookout for that. I know that Brad does great work over at Busting Brackets. He mentioned to me that he was writing something before the show. Brad, any insight as to what this could be? Because I'm waiting patiently for it.
Portsmouth Invitational Preview starts tomorrow. I've given the 5 players that I think will get combine invites, because there is a minimum of 5 players from Portsmouth Invitational need to be invited to the NBA combine. And 4 of the 5 players who were invited last year were drafted, and the 5th was Jamel Artis, who is now on the Orlando Magic.
Good stuff. I'm a huge Portsmouth fan. I usually write something at the end of Portsmouth with my general thoughts on the tournament. I had people really enjoyed that piece last year, so I'll probably bring that back at some point early next week. So be on the lookout for that. Be on the lookout for Brad's stuff on Portsmouth. We'll be tweeting about it because college basketball never stops, as we said. Good night, everybody, and thanks for listening.